Hi, this is Lee Ferguson of the Biology Space with setting up your interactive notebook for use. In the previous video, you learned how to add tabs to stay organized, usefulness of cover sheets, and how to add Ziploc bags to hold loose items in the notebook. In this video, you'll learn how to set up your interactive notebook for use, incorporating the most important organizational tool, the table of contents, and the left-right side orientation versus the chronologic orientation of information. So let's get started. Organization matters. As you probably have already been able to tell, we spent a lot of time talking about organization, but I can't emphasize enough that organization really does matter. And that first and foremost, again, model the behavior you want to see in your students by establishing a notebook of your own. If you establish your own notebook, it actually makes it much, much easier to make it a habitual action for you to check your notebook every day so that students can see, oh, hey, this is probably where I should be with my notebook as well. How you set your notebook up is largely dependent on a few things. Number one, your subject area. I teach science, so my notebook is also used not only just for class notes, but it's also used as our lab notebook as well. The grade level that you teach, I teach primarily seniors in high school, but say an elementary school teacher might, utilize an interactive notebook to organize her students' work by subject area that she's covering in class that day. And you also need to think about how you plan to utilize the interactive notebook. Is this notebook a way to organize all the work that students do? Or is it a way to organize just certain pieces of the work? Like, say, for example, is it just for student notes? Or is it just for labs? Are you using it as a portfolio to demonstrate learner growth throughout the year? Or is it just a collection of bell ringer activities? I know in my classroom, the notebook that my students keep manages to be a portfolio that demonstrates growth throughout the year, but it is also used to organize all of their work. We don't keep a separate binder. We don't keep a separate lab notebook. Everything my students do goes into this interactive notebook. And so the way I use an interactive notebook with my students might be very different from the way that you plan to utilize a notebook with your students. So let's talk about the table of contents. The table of contents is the easiest organizational tool, but it is probably the most important. It helps to keep items in chronological order. It can be handwritten, but it can also be computer generated. When I first started notebooking, my table of contents was handwritten, and then a student actually suggested to me, hey, Mrs. Ferguson, could you keep a Google Doc where we could see every single day what goes in the table of contents so that we're not relying on you to remember to, manually keep up your table of contents. And they had called me out on not being organized. I said, okay, sure, I'll go ahead and keep a Google Doc. And so the really nice thing about keeping a computer generated table of contents is that I can see from year to year the activities that I do or don't do, because they're never exactly the same from year to year. I would advise you to maintain your table of contents on a daily basis, just so you don't get behind. And again, you're modeling good behavior for your students. We use a learning management system at my campus, and so my students have access to the table of contents through the LMS. What you see here is the table of contents I maintained last year. You can see that I started handwriting it, but then I actually just cut and pasted my Google Doc into my notebook. Also, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, the letter H, the first few pages of my notebook are reserved for other items, like a pocket for a formula chart, the cover page, the About Me page, which I'll talk about in another video. How you choose to establish your table of contents and where you choose to establish it is entirely up to you. Let's talk about the organization of the notebook itself, the left side, right side organization versus chronological organization. I get a lot of questions about, do you do left side, right side organization? My answer to that is no, and I'll explain why here in just a minute, but let's talk about what that means. Traditionally, interactive notebooks have been oriented in what is known as the left side, right side orientation. Left side, right side orientation refers to student input going on one side, teacher input going on the other. And I'll give you more detail in the next part of the video. But there's also chronological order, which allows for much more flexible organization of information. At least that's what I found to be true for me and my students. You need to do what you think is going to work for you and your students. There's really, in my opinion, not a right way or a wrong way to do this. I think that some teachers feel like the left side, right side is the only way to do an interactive notebook, and I would argue that that's not the only way that you can do it, that will be effective for you and your students. You really do have to find what works best for you and your students. So let's talk about left side, right side orientation for just a minute. The left side of the notebook is often used for student input. It's often called output, and this side attempts to engage students with course content through the use of concept maps, drawings, sketches, cartoons that the students produce, graphic organizers that the students produce, poems, songs, foldables, and these are just a very few examples. Students can choose the method of output that they, utilize the content with, or it can be chosen for them. Ideally, the students choose. But sometimes the teacher determines, hey, maybe this would be the best way to, demonstrate that they've learned this idea. Let's make a concept map, or, write me a song about photosynthesis, for example, in my course. The left side is traditionally reserved for things that the students make or produce. Right side orientation is a little bit different in that this is used for teacher-generated information. So anything that teachers would give students, for example, notes that the teacher would make and give to students, learning objectives or targets the teacher might have the students look at saying, hey, here's what our objective is for the day, or in my state, here's the TEK for the day. Textbook notes that the teacher may give. Vocabulary lists. Along with that, I would also say study guides, handouts with information. Anything that is placed on these pages is new information and has to be processed by the student on the left side of the notebook. And again, this is the traditional way that I've seen interactive notebooks set up. I will be honest, I tried this for a semester and it did not work for me. It also didn't work for my students because they would ask me, well, Mrs. Ferguson, we have a lot of blank right side pages. And I think part of the reason why that was is I also flipped my classroom, so there's actually not a lot of teacher-generated information. There's a lot of student output, but not so much teacher input. And so I actually ended up going with chronological order in terms of organization, and that is what I have found to work best for me and my students. So chronological order is what it sounds like it is. You're just keeping things in order by the dates you assign them, the dates students complete them, or the dates that you give these items out in class. To me, this method works really well when you have an abundance of student input. So in other words, if you're having your students consistently make products that demonstrate learning, the chronological order of organization in a notebook is the way to go. Obviously, you're going to use cover sheets and tabs and a table of contents. Again, you've got to stay organized. And so the cover sheet and tabs for me and my students are critically important because this is what separates one unit from the next. And then again, I sound like a broken record, but you have to do what works best for you and your students. What works for some teachers may not work for all teachers. And again, for me, chronological order was what worked best for me and my students. So the next video in the series is going to move us a little bit further along with our notebooks and personalizing them. In other words, making them more yours. And in personalizing them, you're actually creating a teaching and learning tool. You just don't realize it yet. Well, I hope that you learned a lot, and I look forward to teaching you next time.